In this session, we'll discuss three key ideas that of economic development, technological change, and poverty alleviation, which I had briefly mentioned in the last lecture. Just to remind you, our familiarity with these ideas is essential as you begin to think about how to evaluate technologies intended for the poor in developing countries. Our story begins at the end of World War II because this was the historical moment when these three ideas were brought together to form a set of policies to increase workers' productivity and raise the living standards in developing countries. Developed countries had used technological knowledge to industrialize and raise living standards much before World War II. Now developing countries wanted to do the same. But times had changed. Developing countries faced a new set of constraints, which we'll talk about later in this lecture. Let's begin by discussing how the term development signified a new set of aspirations in the second half of the 20th century. With the end of colonialism, developmental goals began to be formulated both at the national and international levels. Note that nation building and creation of a stable economic order were the main priorities at the moment. For the first time, rich and poor countries started to negotiate exchange of funds and technical expertise necessary to foster economic growth. There wasn't then a direct emphasis on poverty alleviation per se, but it was assumed that the benefits of economic growth fostered the new national global linkages through international trade, and it would eventually trickle down to the poor at the local level. It is important to note that even though economic growth was the priority, the overarching goals of modernization of newly formed nation states required equally ambitious changes in the political and social systems. The key assumption underlying this macro strategy was that capitalism as an economic system, democracy as a political system, and autonomy of the individuals as social agents were interconnected. The three modernizations that of economic, political, and social were supposed to complement each other, not only in promoting economic growth, but also ensuring political stability during times of massive social transformation. Now let's focus on technological change as a second important idea. In the broadest sense, the word technology can mean a way of doing things. However, in early developmental thought, technology meant the know-how and the technical infrastructure necessary to induce economic growth through rapid industrialization and agricultural modernization. Increase in productivity was a central goal of this paradigm, and technology was key to achieving it. The scientific and rational basis of how technology was to be upgraded for rapid economic growth also influenced the way the new nation state sought to transform their political and social systems. For example, developing nations were to build Western-style democracies, which assumed rational decision-making by individual voters. This was in sharp contrast to the previously existing systems, which relied on customary beliefs and kin and clan loyalties. Socially, this transformation meant making modern citizens out of colonial subjects. Finally, let's discuss the meaning of the term poverty alleviation. On the surface, this term means various efforts to raise income and consumption by the poor. But a more deeper investigation of poverty alleviation strategies reveals that the goal was not confined just to raising the incomes of those living in poverty. It was also about creating a new kind of individual, from subsistence farmer to industrial worker, from subject to citizen, and from passive recipient of development aid to the informed individual consumer. Pay attention to the assumptions being made here. If the aim was to engineer society towards the triple goals of modernization, how were the poor to be viewed in structuring projects and policies? Initially, the poor were assumed to have a set of unfavorable personal characteristics like ignorance, passivity, and communal attachments, which had to be transformed for nation building. This was in sharp contrast with the ambitious goals of the modernization process, which required that the poor develop a particular type of instrumental rationality. This instrumental rationality had to be cultivated through education. Within education, a familiarity of the modern scientific approach was emphasized to create the modern citizen. In general, the outlook of the poor had to become more scientific, more analytical than superstitious, and in general, more rational. Now that we have defined the three main topics of this lecture, we'll spend the rest of our time discussing in detail the historical context within which this early development paradigm emerged. Remember, I mentioned in the first lecture how important it is to have a historical sensibility to assess technologies today. Drawing on historical knowledge, you can ask questions such as, to what extent between then and now has the development context changed due to changing technologies? Did development social goals change, and do we need different criteria for evaluation of technologies today? In other words, can evaluations of technologies be restricted to just evaluating the technology itself, or do we need to ask larger questions? One of the most important aspects to keep in mind about the late 1940s and 50s is the wave of decolonization that took place after World War II. Most countries in Africa, Asia joined those in Latin America as independent nations and had to deal with unprecedented economic, political, and social challenges. For example, the colonial relationships of production that exploited cheap raw materials in the colonies had left these now newly independent countries without significant manufacturing capabilities or infrastructure. As a result, former colonies had to promote growth starting from an economic structure mainly based on extractive industries and subsistence agriculture. Another challenge was that of institutions necessary to foster scientific and technological knowledge, both public and private, were still nascent, and in many cases non-existent. For the institutions and organizations that did exist, such as the system of public administration, their ability to readily enhance technical know-how was very limited. The institutions were primarily established by colonial powers to maintain the economic, political, and social control over the colonies. These bureaucracies were not motivated to induce technological change, which was necessary for rapid economic growth. In addition to decolonization, another major historical fact we should consider as we think about development, technology, and poverty was the emergence of two major superpowers after the end of Second World War, the US and Soviet Union, and the start of the Cold War. Importantly, the emergence of the US and Soviet Union as superpowers confirmed that technological knowledge had immense impact on their geopolitical influence. Following the example set by these leading nations, the idea of developing nations should try to technologically catch up became quite influential in developmental discourse. From a technical standpoint, the learning and innovation that took place in these two countries were in many ways unprecedented. Massive investment in education, technology, and infrastructure led both the United States and Soviet Union to become two of the fastest growing economies in a relatively short period of time. Given this context, it is not hard to imagine how appealing this narrative must have been to developing countries. Many, if not most countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America face the same challenges that largely subsistence economies to transform and pressure to do so quickly. Hence, these countries began serious efforts to modernize economically, politically, and socially. Increasing technical know-how was essential to this process of large-scale social transformation. This kind of technology-driven development, however, had the potential to create negative consequences. This was particularly true when nuclear energy was used as a weapon of war. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shown the world that technological knowledge could be used for destructive purposes as well. The Cold War heightened this anxiety of apocalypse. The technological success of the superpowers raised important moral questions, too, about whether the benefits of large-scale technology outweighed the risk it inherently forced humanity to bear. Ironically, the developing nations' search for protective measures led to even bigger investment in technical know-how. In conclusion, I'd like to highlight three key takeaways from this session. First, in the 1940s and 50s, there were a large number of recently established nations eager to promote development, but starting from primarily subsistence economies. Number two, to move from subsistence agriculture to modern agriculture required technological advancement and know-how. Similarly, to move from rural to urban industrial economy also required technical advancement and know-how. In other words, technological upgrading and skill development was indispensable for nation building and rapid economic growth. Number three, Colonial modes of international governance were replaced by the indirect influence exercised by the United States and Soviet Union as superpowers promoting the economic and ideological advantages of capitalism and socialism respectively. Though widely opposed ideologically, both these camps believed in progress through technological modernization. Let me ask a fourth lesson. Even though technology was mostly seen in a positive light at that time, capable of generating rapid economic growth, militaristic applications of technology created suspicion about its potential negative effects as well.
That was at 9:48, so it was under 10